We were at the real height of numbers of violent crime in this country. And since then, it's just consistently declined. And we will have a couple years where it goes up, but it's mostly declined. And it's been declining in our society at the same time. We have made the access to weapons and high power weapons ever more readily available, which is, as human beings, we actually have self-regulating functions, even when we haven't made justice widely available. And I mean like real justice and equity, giving people equal access to resources, not making available the kind of weapons and instruments that make us less safe.
Hey, it's Broken Office Chair, a podcast produced by Alternatives. Broken Office Chair is hosted by Alternatives Executive Director, Bessie Alcantara. Bessie is a Chicago native, first-generation Salvadoran Mexican-American who's passionate about dismantling systemic racism. In each episode, Bessie will be joined by her friends and colleagues who are ready to speak candidly about their experiences as people of color in their various professions. In the episodes, they'll address topics such as issues in the nonprofit sector, racial equity, DEI in practice, and much, much more. So stay tuned.
So today I am joined by Candice Jones, President and CEO of Public Welfare Foundation, and Thena Robinson-Mock, Vice President of Programs at Public Welfare Foundation. Thank you all for joining me today.
Hey, Bessie, glad to be with you. How you doing?
I am good now that we've troubleshooted my internet issues.
It's life, post-COVID life, we know.
So Candice is in DC and Thena is in Georgia. So we're doing a Zoom today. And today is the day that I had 20 minutes worth of internet issues, right? To kick us off, I actually want you, Candice, to share a little bit with our listeners as to, this is the first time we have two folks on the podcast at the same time. And so I wanted to share what the rationale was for you.
Oh, I love that. Well, when I met you interestingly enough at this dinner that was for women leaders, which I just sort of love the space in general. And you were talking about the work and said, come on the podcast, talk about your work. And I was like, I love that. And I wanted to bring another incredible woman leader that I just adore and respect with me to have her voice. It's hard as a leader. There's sort of all this tension of how you lead, period, how you lead as a Black person, how you lead as a woman, how you lead as a Black woman. But one of the things I'm conscious of is, you want to lead both in a way that rebuffs all of the isms in the world, but at the same time just feels natural and authentic. And sometimes what I want to be doing is bringing the voices of leaders who I also want to see and hear into the conversation with me. And so I got my colleague here, Thena, this morning. And Bessie, you were just dope enough to be like, I'm going to create that space for you guys. So we love it.
I love it. I mentioned to you, it's been one of the constant themes of the podcast is how do we share power? How do we create more seats at the table as opposed to competing for seats at the table, right? And so I love seeing it in action. To kick us off, though, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got to this point? And by this point, I could mean in life, at work, however you want to answer that.
That was a lot. So I am born and raised in Chicago, grew up in Austin, grew up on the west side of Chicago, was also, always very sort of attuned, even before I had words for it, the justice system, and always kind of wanted to be a lawyer for a lot of reasons, both because of what I was seeing going on with people I loved in my community and my family, but, also because I grew up by a young single mom and had to make a choice that felt suitable, right? Like we couldn't afford for me to go follow some dream and be an artist or something. And so I love it. And I've done justice reform, some form of it, my entire career. I did direct representation when I was for youth and adults when I was still a student, came out, ended up at the MacArthur Foundation, which I can talk about philanthropy because I didn't even know what it was when I got into it, and was working on a national youth justice initiative, left because I wanted to be in public service. Like I chose to go to government. I felt like it was an important role for a professional. And I did a federal tour of duty and a state tour of duty in the state of Illinois. In the federal role, I did a lot of work with the Department of Ed on who gets access to education resources on incarcerated youth and the adult criminal justice side. came back, worked in the state OMB running the justice policy part of the state budget, and then ended up running the youth prison system there through a period of some significant reforms. Left and went to Chicago CRIB, which is a violence organization, and that made a lot of sense. And then ended up in DC, where I am now at public welfare, back in philanthropy, giving money. And I absolutely can talk about, it's funny, I always say to young people, I'm like, your career is kind of like a patchwork quilt. When you're looking back at it, it looks like it makes perfect sense. When you're living it, it feels like you're just falling forward. But I can talk about how those steps, felt like they had through lines. But Thena?
This is always a fun question. And it's funny what you said, Candice, about philanthropy, because I don't think many of us woke up thinking we were going to be.
Nobody knows what it is. And why would you? And I think that.
All right. We had a little bit of technical difficulties. And so now we are back. And Thena, you were about to tell your story.
Yeah. So I was just making a little joke that none of us get to philanthropy really by intention, at least a lot of us, right? We just sort of find our way here, or maybe it finds us. But just to talk a little bit about my background, I started my career doing justice work. I like to sort of pinpoint it to Louisiana, a lot of justice work there. Started off as a youth justice attorney, did a lot of education work. I really sort of talk about those two issues together, education and youth justice. A lot of the framing for that was work around ending the school to prison pipeline. And I did that work in a place that at the time was the number one incarceration capital of the world. And that's Louisiana. I believe it's number 2 now, but it's still not a good number. Did some work there, worked with a lot of young people in the state for a little bit of time, ran a nonprofit called Rethink that was all about reimagining spaces, including schools and communities, and really doing that in a way that really elevated and amplified young people's voices. And that organization came online, Rethink, at a time when the city of New Orleans was reeling from Hurricane Katrina. So there was a recovery period there, and there were all these questions about justice that really surfaced from that work. Fast forward a bit, moved from New Orleans to Washington, D.C., did some work on the national level for an organization advancement project, and then found my way really into philanthropy through a group that was funding grassroots organizations that were advancing ed justice and youth justice. And interesting enough, that's around the time I would say that public welfare came on my radar. From there, came over to public welfare and stepped into a role where I was supporting and leading our justice portfolio in the South. And one thing I'll just lift up there is that work in the South is deeply important to me. I have the privilege of supporting organizations in Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi. Historically, the South has been underfunded in so much of its work. And it's a place where I have been deeply moved and inspired by really the courage of so many organizers who do so much with so little. So just really honored to be able to do that work. And now serving in this role as vice president of programs, really being able to support the work across the foundation. So really exciting work.
Question.
Yeah.
Pros, cons, philanthropy, nonprofit, government.
Oh,
if you had to pick one track for the rest of your career, which one would it be?
Wow.
Oh, oh my God, Bessie, that's like a hard question.
It's a great question.
I asked somebody that went into philanthropy recently. I was like, would you go back to being an ED? They were like, no. It's a variation of that question.
Thena, I don't know how you would answer that. I feel like if I'm honest with you, I would not. I have spent more time in philanthropy and government than I have spent in nonprofits, but I would not pick to be in one for the rest of my career. And one, because I think if you're in philanthropy too long, you can atrophy.
Mm-hmm.
It's like an athlete out of training. I think there are important things you could bring into philanthropy, but I think it might be I'd be afraid to hear myself say I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. Government, I think, is so important because I think the potential to shape real change and the danger of getting it all wrong, the stakes are never higher. But you do that too long and it can literally kill whatever drove you to do it in the first place.
Yeah.
And so I think they're both about dosing. And I think nonprofits have roles to play somewhere in between. I think there's a little bit of magic if you do the musical chairs right over the course of a career. Because it's I probably got 30, 40 years left to work. It's to do one of them for that whole time, I can't imagine the kind of crazy I'd be capable of.
Yeah, that is such a great question. I've not had a ton of experience working in government. That's a little bit of an unknown for me. I feel like I've always been on the other side of that. I guess what I would say is the sweet spot is maybe being able to push at all of those different points. Like if you're in a spot where you can influence where dollars are going and you can, do some advocacy and some programmatic work, and you can also do some important systems change and transformation. Like it's a sweet spot. I feel like I'm butchering your question, but if you're able,
I love how neither of you are willing to commit.
That's a tough one.
I'm also explicit about not being willing to commit. I'm like, I know I could not do one of those fields for the rest of my life. Right. Also, I feel like it misses the opportunity because I always feel like so much of a career is not about the titles or role. It's just like, if we're in a football game, you're trying to run your mission. Like you're just trying to run your mission. You're trying to gain yards over your career. And it's like, if you're just worried about that, you miss the opportunity to be like, actually, no, it's time for me to pivot. Because I think if I go into this role and pull that lever, it's gonna we're gonna gain some yards. And so I'm always just running that ball down the field. I'm not so concerned about this or that for the balance of it. Like, I try not to think about work like that because then I feel like I'm missing what's my actual point.
But I think it also speaks to values, right? Because if you're prioritizing right now furthering the mission or furthering the work, that's what both of you are talking about. But if you were prioritizing, for example, your financial stability and the well-being, your mental health well-being, I wonder if your answer would be a little bit different. And they're both nodding for listeners.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Because I think government for the balance of your career could be really hard for your mental health, for morale. So I definitely agree with that. And it's easy for me to say because one of the choices I made throughout my career, I don't have kids and I'm in a relationship, but I'm not married. And it's not lost on me that choices I've been able to make as a professional are fundamentally tied to that because there's a responsibility that comes with those choices also to sort of earn in a way. And it's there's a part of me that has the freedom to be I'm going to run this ball hard and absorb risks around it. Because if I take a blow, I can absorb it differently as opposed to being I absorb it as I'm forcing a whole unit to absorb that. So I think it's complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Thena, you're a parent. So how does that come up for you?
Yeah, I mean, Candice, what you just said resonates so much. I mean, I think the choices you make in terms of career and sort of where you're playing your position does connect to what's going on in your world, who you are, how you're showing up, and being able to have, some semblance of balance is helpful, I think, when you are a parent. And so just figuring out, but I don't even want to just say parent, though, because we all need balance, honestly, for our mental wellness, right? And our mental wholeness. We all need that balance. And so for some of us, and I think I would probably put myself in this category, if I'm not doing something justice related, that is not, I don't feel mentally well. I have to be doing something in whatever continuum that looks like. I have to be doing something so that I can feel whole, even if that might mean, a little bit of emotional stress, But I think as a parent, you're making a lot of choices because, when you turn off the Zoom or when you take that last call for the day or do whatever you're doing. There's a whole nother factor of considerations there that you're thinking about.
Do you guys think, especially if you're doing the work of social justice, it informs how you are as a parent? Because you just made this point, Thena, of being even though it takes a little more mental strain, it's sort of the work that drives me, so I want to do it. Do you think it impacts how you show up as a parent? And then if that's true, is it for better or worse?
Yeah, I would say yes, it shows up in some ways that might be positive, in some ways that may be not so great. I think on the positive side, I think what keeps me in this work is, I look at my son, I think about the kind of world that I want to help transform for him. He has to grow up in this world at some point. He's 4 years old now, cute and cuddly. But the world may not think so in a few years, and they may not think so now. And so I'm just thinking about all of that. But he, I think, keeps me grounded and rooted. One thing I have to pay attention to, though, is if I am feeling a little bit stressed or overwhelmed, that zaps your energy, And so you really, it is about how can you find that balance and that peace so that you can show up for this little person who needs you all the time? But I would say there's more pros than cons, because I think he keeps me grounded and rooted in the work.
I love that.
It's interesting, though, because I feel like this work is what scared me off of being a parent. Candice is nodding hard.
Totally. No, I think I would say there's a lot of reasons why I don't have, because I don't think humans are too complex. I don't think any of us does anything for like one singular reason. Like we're just not, we'd probably be much easier and happier if we were capable of that. But there is no question about it that like growing up on the west side of Chicago, like watching like Black men, like you're like, be like hunted and revered, like literally in a way that is like horrifying, makes you think, do I want to bring a child into the world that looks like me, that reflects me, and then like subject them to that? Like, there's no question about it. There's a part of me that's like, I'm not, strong enough for that. I have a niece and nephew now, Thena knows, and they're cute, and like anything that has your like biological DNA, what you part of it is that's reflecting you back to you, and they're so cute. But it's also sort of like terrifying because we haven't yet delivered them the world where they're truly safe or free. And it's a lot to ask of parents of color. And it's just like on top of the things I wanted to accomplish in my life, it wasn't a sacrifice I was going to make. It's not easy.
Y'all do some really hard work too. I say y'all like I'm not in the nonprofit field, but we're, but we talked a little bit about the fact that your organization, one of the focuses is justice reform. And so when you're talking about this topic of how Black men are treated, this is, I think, a really core intertwined issue with justice reform. How did you end up here?
Yeah, I ended up here because of lived experience. Like I said, growing up in Austin, it's like we had all these family members and it's just like as everybody got to Thena's point, from cute baby stage to like young adolescent, they went from this thing that was adorable to something that was fear. And all of a sudden, I always talk about my cousin, grew up in Chicago, right over by Midway. And he was beautiful and funny and sweet and had a child young who was special needs, never would learn to walk on his own, would never be able to speak, go to the bathroom. Like they took care of him. And I would watch my like 16-year-old at the time, Black cousin, and I always say this, I was like, if Black men could be all American, he would have been what all American was, like beautiful Black skin, good teeth, like nurture his baby and like, clean him off from a bathroom break or things like that. And at the same time, to the world, he's like public enemy number one, in part because he's trying to find ways to bring resources in to care for this child. And like living, like really struggling, living in poverty, which I didn't totally understand that. Because when you're young and you don't have nothing, it always seems like it's enough. You have to have context in the world to know what you are being deprived of. But I think experiences like that early on made this issue like a no. Like I didn't go in and say, I'm going to do like environmental justice or I'm going to do this. Like I felt like the criminal justice system, youth justice system was ripping not just like abstract Black and, brown communities apart. Like it was ripping mine apart. I grew up not that far from Humboldt Park in Chicago. It's like you couldn't miss it. You couldn't miss what the system was doing to those communities. And so I don't think I picked this issue. It picked me.
I've been thinking about this a little bit because it's like I feel like there's a lot of different points where I got drawn to this issue. I would say I'm a history fanatic. So growing up, I always, I was like that. That was the random kid who liked watching Eyes on the Prize all the time, which is so random. But, we didn't have a lot of channels back then.
Powerful theme song.
Exactly. And I just really got moved very deeply at an early age about just like the civil rights fight, human rights fight, all of that. And when I started to learn about the prison industrial complex, that started to come on my radar when I was in high school and in college. It was the one issue that I just could not look away from. And so there was a big thread for me, like studying that in school. I didn't have any immediate family members who were incarcerated, but I knew that the criminal justice system was affecting, my community, my people. I knew exactly what that link was. And then I visited a prison in Louisiana. And it just changed my whole life. And that prison was Angola prison. And it looked just like a plantation and still does. And I remember going to visit that prison with colleagues. We were visiting death row, visiting a couple of our clients. And I was not an attorney at the time, just to be clear. I was a paralegal working on cases. But I remember having such a different reaction to that place than some of my colleagues. Many of them a little jaded. I think many of them had been there before millions of times. But I just was not okay seeing that. And at the time, I thought I was going to go into a different sort of track of civil rights law. But criminal justice just reeled me in. And I was like, this is the issue that I have to fight for. There are so many issues of our time, but this is the issue that we got to figure out. And so it's just always been kind of a through line in a lot of my work.
It's interesting because it is one of the main things that is like tearing families apart. And there's so much overlap between what is happening in the justice system and our concept of militarization in general, what's happening with the Border Patrol right now. And so like there's overlap across communities and globally, right, our view of policing and punishment. And so it's funny because I wanted to go through an immigrants' rights type of routes. Yeah. And that is not where I ended up. Instead, I've done a lot of justice work at different points of the pipeline. But I see now, well, it's funny, you mentioned, Candice, like how not knowing about philanthropy. And for me, it was like not knowing about social work, period. I didn't learn about this field, social services, until I graduated from undergrad. And so I've been learning on the go because my parents didn't have this concept. And then school doesn't teach you this concept. And so I like fall into the field. And then that's how I start slowly being able to connect the dots and stayed here. Because I do agree with you, Thena. This is one of the issues that if we can get a good handle on, it would break open so many other things that we need to address.
I love that you raised that. One of the things that I feel like in the debate on family separation, we missed was that switch was what we took was a system that had principally to that point been treated as an administrative system. And we made what was just sort of like getting access to resources, creating opportunity for a new life criminal. Mm-hmm. And then we use that system to do something we do in America every day, which is strip. We say, oh, if it's criminal, then we can strip you from your families. No explanation. Mm-hmm. No repercussions. And it's interesting because there are also with the use of private facilities, as they depopulated on the criminal side with more scrutiny, they tried to transition more to immigration detention. And it's like there's so many overlaps. And the more we're in conversation about them, the less people will be able to use them in that way.
It's funny that this is also coming up because, the conversation about the asylum seekers right now, Chicago being a sanctuary city, there's been some conversations to introduce, is it legislation and ordinance? I forget the process for at each level, but to introduce something to remove our sanctuary city status because there is a lot of backlash around the use of resources and not knowing, like people are not connecting that like you dehumanize one population, it's a slope to like dehumanize everybody every time they inconvenience you.
Yeah. But I mean, that's the mastery of America, sort of just as a social experiment, right? The ability to have pit communities of color against each other in this place where fundamentally, if sort of marginalized communities, poor whites too, right? And this is why they killed Fred Hampton. It's like if they had ever figured out that our interests were more aligned than the people who were pitting us against each other, the shape of our democracy would have been more fulsome. Like we would have demanded different things. And you see it today in these cities where you're having these debates where essentially they're going to end up putting brown people against each other in a way that serves none of them.
What comes up, though, is the idea that resources are scarce. And I always call it the myth of scarcity, because one of the things I think that we should have learned through the pandemic is that resources are not scarce when they affect the right people. They're only scarce when they impact us.
That's right.
I've been seeing prominent leaders in Chicago speak about needing to get rid of the asylum seekers because of the need for resources for Black communities. And I'm like, there's plenty of resources. They just don't want to be distributed.
That's exactly right. I also understand recently, like the city's been looking at offering some raises to folks like CPD. I'm sure at some point they'll be like, when resources are necessary, they'll find them. And in these instances, they're necessary. And I mean, this is something that Thena and I in philanthropy talk about a lot. Like we find all these ways and places where there are pools of money to justify what's necessary or not. And particularly because issues like justice reform and access to justice, immigration, we've taken this position that they're not, these fundamental pillars of our society, sort of like education is, or like healthcare is, some of these things that feel safer and evergreen. And we're always like, oh, it's a no-brainer. We got to deal with this. We allow them to sort of be batted back across in these sort of not that well-founded debates in ways that don't inform the public about what's possible and what's necessary to make things fair. Well, the global crisis on the earth warming is going to lead quite naturally to migration, which people have done since the beginning of time. And so it's like we're having these debates out of the context of how do we deal with the things we really need to deal with, including looking at our immigration system and creating viable paths for people to be able to immigrate legally, which is like none of these debates about that stuff we want to take on. And so then we just respond in really disorganized way to crises on the back end, and that's not okay.
Yeah. And I think this question around resources is just so interesting because I think often when communities have not been provided resources and when you demand those things, you're made to feel as if what you're asking for is too much or pie in the sky, when you can look and see, well, we actually can see where the resources are being invested. Like we know they are there. There's evidence that they're there. We're not asking you to create anything that's not there. It's really
a zero-sum game, right? If migrants get resources, the Black community can't. No, they can both do that. And we could take some of this big corporate money that we've yet to adequately tax.
What that also brings up for me is that there was this quote when talking about defunding police, and people are like, what would happen? And there was this quote from by AOC circulating the internet around like, all we have to do is look at suburbs and we can see a model for less policing, but folks can't imagine it. I think a lot of this has to do with, one, what we see as individual responsibility, right? You can't help that you got sick, but you can help that you made bad decisions and ended up in the prison system. It's kind of how we view it. And then two, who is like deserving, like how we value people, and they're intertwined. There's an overlap between those two. But I think that's a lot of what prompts this conversation around how do we distribute resources.
Yeah. Only just wanted to comment quickly on that piece around just there's this dehumanizing narrative out there, right? And sort of to underscore your point about who's deserving. I just get really concerned about that because it definitely sort of determines like how decisions are made about resources.
One of the things I was going to talk about is public welfare. We talk a lot about this thing we call reinvestment. It's been a big through line in our strategy shift since we started this work in 2018. And, one of the interesting things about this debate about funding police or not is actually in a lot of ways, the way we've talked about it is that what we need to do is fund communities. This gets to the point that you were referencing. And it's like, and it's not a zero-sum game. I'm not asking you where you taking it from. I'm just saying it's a fundamental right of communities of color to indeed be safe. And we know that the way that you get to safety is not through a militarized force, it's through investment, right? Safety looks like paved roads and small businesses thriving and kids out trick-or-treating and playing on the street and well-lit neighborhoods and flourishing parks and arts and culture, And it's like communities of colors deserves that. And I think this is this point. We know what safety looks like. We do it in affluent white communities in America every day. That's what safety looks like. And we want to gaslight communities of color to be like, oh, if you want $3, you got to take it from this budget, right? We got to take it out of the migration budget. When the truth is like none of those things. It's all a non-starter. What these communities deserve and should demand is the same fundamental rights we see everywhere else, which is just deep investment.
I want to connect it to what is happening now. And I think this is really interesting because, you're down south. And how are you seeing like the Supreme Court justice decisions, what's happening in Florida, what's happening in Texas, impacting your work? I'm in Chicago. I'm in the little Democratic hub, although some days that doesn't mean much, but
Right.
Well, Malcolm said the South.
Exactly.
Malcolm said the South was anything below Canada. So, I mean, and I think we're seeing that. Like, I always tell my friends who live in the northern cities, and what I'm like, please don't think you're safe. Please don't. But I think what you're seeing in the South is interesting. I mean, like, it is a little bit of the status quo, right? We have seen these issues come up in the South in terms of everything from voter suppression, horrible case law coming down, awful policies, all the things. When I talk to organizers here in the South, they sort of reiterate that it lifts up why you have to invest in the South, because it is such a blueprint for the nation in terms of horrible policies, all the things. But again, I don't think any place is safe. It's just that we see a lot of lack of investment here. We see a particularly cruel kind of policy making that we can certainly trace back to, enslavement and all the things. Like, you can see that through line here, I think, more visibly in the South. But I just think it's important to lift up that those policies have been transmitted all over the country. So no place is safe. And if we can look at that sort of universally, I think that matters. But I do think it is worth lifting up the ways in which criminalization has sort of played out. Florida, Texas, Georgia, now Louisiana. There was a really important governor's race recently in Louisiana that we need to be paying attention to. And, we won't get too much into all of that. But what I'll say is that that's a state that we need to look at in terms of how policies might get, transmitted to other places. But Candice, please add on to that.
No, I think your point on that, the South is a place where deep investment is so necessary. The lion's share of our strategy focuses on the South and the Midwest. It's not an accident because we intentionally chose sites at public welfare that we feel like have sort of really been underinvested in by national philanthropy. You have places that were saturated with resources. You have your Illinois and Chicago's, your California's, your New York. Some places in the South, Louisiana, has seen a lot of national investment from philanthropy. And you look at these places and you're like, oh my God, there's so many amazing groups there and they're so innovative. Sometimes I tell people, it's like, are all the brilliant people in Oakland and Silicon Valley? No, a lot of money is. And so where you have places where there's sort of deep, rich investment, you have the space for real innovation. And so we are trying as an institution to say, if we can focus these resources on places like the South, where we know there's a ton of innovative people doing great work on fumes, right? In some of the places that are hardest to work, not because there isn't racism everywhere, because I think we have mastered, and I say this as like born and bred Chicago, we have mastered covert racism in the Midwest, right? But in places like the South, where it's a little more overt and they can test a lot of policies, that they're then just going to have to figure out how to proliferate to all the other places. I think it's important to give resources to those places that have been starved out, like the South, like the Midwest, because if we can really invest there, we can make more formidable the change that we're trying to see in the places where it's most challenging.
I feel like this is really like heavy work. And so I want to ask, like, how do y'all keep your hope up? Because my brain is going in a million different directions. Because to go to Thena's point, I do think that the Supreme Court rulings have taught us that nobody is safe, right? I didn't think I could ever see a Supreme Court ruling undone. Mm-hmm. And so that, I think, has been really impactful because it's a question of what's next. And then justice is sit on the bench for life. And so when you start to get into like these details and you're watching what's happening domestically or nationally, I should say, and then we have elections coming up, how do you guys keep your hope up in the work? Because I feel like you can't do this work without hope.
Yeah, that's very important. And you nailed it. I mean, I think that hope piece is key. The whole quote, hope is a discipline, all those things, very real. I think we have to channel that in moments where it's hard. I think that, interesting, we were talking about young people a moment ago and children and all those things. Like, I think that does give me hope. I feel like I'm seeing some light with the generation coming up, inspired by all of the different movements that keep sparking and emerging, inspired by folks who are just making a way out of no way. I think what keeps me sort of in this and hopeful is it just feels like a duty. We have to keep going. We have to keep going. I think about my grandmother and trying to channel her strength. Yeah. All those things. Like I got to pull on my ancestors a little bit in times that are hard, but I do it and it does help me.
Yeah. I'm hopeful because I feel like I've seen in the span of my career progress, and it's not always consistently linear progress, but in a net, I think it's progress overall. I think when I started my career, people be like, yeah, what do you do? And I'd be like, oh, I do, I represent people who are accused of crimes, or I do justice reform. And they'd be like, what? Why would you do that? And what sense does that make? Do you help bad people? Like the understanding of the systems and sort of like people weren't talking about racial equity and sort of some of the inherent biases in those systems and how we police and who we police. We weren't talking about that at the time. And when I sort of pull back onto where we are now, it's like, yeah, there's some things about the rhetoric that's resurging right now that's really dangerous. But even when you're asking people like, well, you know what, we actually have to ask some questions. And this isn't always good. These systems aren't really making us safer. And we spend a lot of money on this. And, police hurt people. They can kill people. And we see that now in a way that when I started my career, we didn't see that. We didn't understand that. And I think that ability to identify in our mass populace the injustice inherent in these systems is a real evolution. And it's like, it's not perfect, but it puts more of the wind behind our back and less in our face. And for me in a net career, like I know I'm not going to be the generation that scores the touchdown on this issue, but I know we're gaining yards. Like I'm just trying to get them so the amount they have to run is less. And that keeps me hopeful.
I want you to expand more on the progress that you've seen. And Thena, if you have something, because I feel like when I'm listening to you, what's coming up for me is like the removal of critical race theory from schools and the legislation that they passed a few years back to not be able to talk about race at all if you receive any government funding. And so for me, it feels like steps backwards all the time. And so like hearing you highlight a specific progress is helpful.
I can do, when I came into the system, we were coming out of the 90s. When I had been, in Chicago in high school, we were at the, real height of numbers of violent crime in this country. And since then, it's just consistently declined. And we will have a couple years where it goes up, but it's mostly declined. And it's been declining in our society at the same time. We have made the access to weapons and high power weapons ever more readily available, which is as human beings, we actually have self-regulating functions, even when we haven't made justice widely available. And I mean like real justice and equity, giving people equal access to resources, not making available the kind of weapons and instruments that make us less safe. I think the fact that that number continues to decline in that period is progress. It's progress for us in humanity. At the same time, I think the numbers in youth justice and how we think of youth, that we actually think of kids as kids in the justice system. And so we think if they're going to be engaged in the system, it has to be developmentally appropriate. And we think, actually, is this the way to respond to youth? Like, is this the way to actually set them up on a course? And we look back at those cases from the 90s when we were at the height of this horrible super predator phase. And we say for people who've been incarcerated for 10, 15 years, it's time to look at your case again, determine if you've been rehabilitated and let you go, not just throw you in there and throw away the key for life, losing all that potential, knowing the impact it would have on you and on those families. That's progress, the popular understanding of justice. Whatever you think, that you have campaigns like defund the police, that you have campaigns and organizations like Color of Change and all the Vera Institute of Justice out here talking about all of this work in a big, robust way. People reading the paper, that you would have a public official in Congress having conversations about what safety really means and being able to draw a dichotomy of what that means for race and privilege. That wasn't happening when I started this work. Like, that is progress. And the thing we have to remember, this is like, I always say this to people. I'm like, everybody loves Martin Luther King's quote. It's like the arc of justice, it bends towards justice. Everybody loves the bends towards justice part, but they forget that it's long. Mm-hmm. And all that progress is not linear, right? You think about civil rights, it would be like a case of progress, setbacks. more test cases of progress, setbacks, right? You have critical race theory in schools in, Florida and southern states being challenged. But when I started my career, you didn't have a field of critical race theory. Progress, right? They ban those schools. Those authors sell more books than they have at any other point in their career, right? So it's like, you're right. There are these things we really need to be concerned about. But frankly, I think one of the things we most need to be concerned about is how this idea that we don't pull back and see the hope in our progress demoralizes us in such a way that we don't want to keep fighting, when the truth is that we're advancing on them. It's the reason why you're having these big fights over democracy, big fights over the courts, because as this country becomes more diverse, there's like a critical fight of who will get to, and that gets more dangerous, of who will get to run it in the future. But a net for folks like me who want to see justice and equity, who want to see people of color be treated equally, we're actually advancing in a net. But yeah, it's hard. And nobody told us that it wouldn't be. I think the thing, unfortunately, that we believed is that coming out of civil rights and some of those movements, we were done, when the truth was that we were just the next generation to run that ball down the court.
I think my generation's version of we were done was when Barack Obama got elected. So many folks thought that meant racism was over.
No. Post-racial America, they called it.
Yep.
Yeah. And just to underscore a point that Candice just made, like, there's progress, I think, by the measure of the blowback, right? Like, and it is fierce right now. And so that alone, I think, lets you know, like, okay, this is being heard, it's being felt. So here we are.
So believe it or not, we're coming up on time.
Oh, no.
I always have to tell people that.
Trying to get an internet connection.
What would you advise folks to do to create change or to keep the momentum going?
The thing I always say is educate yourselves, stay engaged. One of the things that I think is going to be so important about this generation, the generations coming, is that, one of the things that we didn't talk about is just civil education, civil discourse, civic education. That's one of the things we've really eroded. This idea that a democracy takes the responsibility of the whole, right? You don't just put somebody out to represent you, you hold them accountable, right? Like, who's your councilman? Who's your alderman? What are they doing? What are they doing? Not just in like the big throws, but on a day-to-day, that continued engagement. And I think around issues of justice reform, that's critically important. They're a publicly funded system. Our tax dollars principally support their function. Most people, if you ask, it's like, what happens to a kid who's incarcerated in your jurisdiction? What happens to somebody when they're in jail? What's the rate of success on that? They have no idea. Folks educating themselves, staying engaged on that is critically important, because that sort of is that kind of civic engagement, civic discourse that actually is how we make real change.
Building on to that, I think hold each other close, build community connections. I think, there's a lot of talk about narrative shift and how narratives drive harmful policies, all those things. Narratives can be conversations with your neighbor, with somebody, parents who you meet at the school, whatever. But I think just figuring out those connections and building them with people and having conversations about safety, and also just staying curious to learn, is really important.
Where can people find you online if they want to follow you?
They can find the foundation at Public Welfare on Twitter or X, look at me, and on Instagram and on Facebook. And we're also on LinkedIn. They can find me at Candice Jones. I'm struggling with that one. I should be sure, but hopefully that's true on X and on LinkedIn and Thena.
Yes, all the same things. Yeah, it's so weird saying X now, but yes, you can find me on there and LinkedIn.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you so much, Bessie. This was great.
To keep up with everything going on at Alternatives or to donate, you can visit us at our website, alternativesyouth.org. You can also follow us at Alternatives Inc. on Instagram or at Alternatives Youth on Facebook. If you want to keep up with Bessie, you can follow her on Instagram and TikTok at Bessie_Alcantara. Broken Office Chair is hosted by Alternatives Executive Director Bessie Alcantara. It's produced, researched, and edited by Catherine Best and Deanna Phillips. Thanks for listening.